Back in September, Foreign Secretary David Lammy announced that the UK would be suspending 30 of around 350 arms export licenses to Israel. In a speech to Parliament, he made it clear what kinds of weapons and weapons parts Israel would no longer be allowed to receive from Britain.
These include equipment that we assess is for use in the current conflict in Gaza, such as important components which go into military aircraft, including fighter aircraft, helicopters and drones, as well as items which facilitate ground targeting.
Now, at the time, the Labour government made various carve-outs. British weapons that Israel only used for defence, whatever that means, could still be exported, as could things like goggles and helmets. The British components for F-35 jets obtained by Israel through the global F-35 supply system would also still get through. That's because Lammy said that national security required the F-35 supply chain remain uninterrupted. But what he made very clear in that speech was that Britain could no longer supply weapons used by Israel in Gaza. To do that, he said, risked making the UK culpable in Israel's breaches of international law. Now, it wasn't a massive result, but it was still a result, except a new report suggests that Britain may have continued sending Israel offensive weapons and weapons parts anyway. Compiled by the Palestinian Youth Movement, Workers for a Free Palestine and Progressive International, the report exposes the UK's previous as well as continuing arms sales to Israel. This is from the report. So it says, the data show that the UK has sent 8,630 separate munitions since the suspensions took effect, all in the category bombs, grenades, torpedoes, mines, missiles, and similar munitions of war and parts thereof other. It says evidence also shows the UK shipped 150,000 bullets to Israel in October 2023. So that's before the suspension came into effect. And the report's research is based on records held by the Israel Tax Authority, which records imports using customs codes. These numbers encode both the source of the import as well as the kind of goods delivered. Using those records, the researchers were able to uncover goods exported to Israel from the UK in three broad categories, so arms and ammunition, tanks, armoured fighting vehicles and parts, and aircraft, spacecraft and parts thereof. What the data shows is that David Lammy's so-called export ban may have had very little effect on the shipment of weapons and weapons parts from the UK to Israel. So this graph shows the number of shipments of aircraft and aircraft parts that took place between October 2023, when Israel's assault on Gaza began, and March this year. The red line marks the date of the export license ban. Now, as you can see, the largest shipment of the whole period took place 2 months after that export ban came into effect. The report is clear that it can't say for certain that these were military aircraft or components being shipped. They could have been for other kinds of planes. But the authors call the increase in shipments that took place at the time concerning, and they're demanding the government release full and transparent export data. The report has a little more evidence in the case of F-35 parts. So it was part of Lammy's pledge that it would be illegal to send F-35 components directly from the UK to Israel. Last year, Declassified reported that prior to September, Britain had sent 14 shipments of F-35 parts to the Israeli military from an RAF base in Norfolk. So again, that's before the export ban came into effect. Now, the report's researchers in this case, managed to identify those 14 shipments and discovered they all used a very particular export code. When they searched the post-ban Israeli imports, that code continued to come up. Their research showed that the UK has continued to send at least 13 further shipments under that code to Israel since September. Again, it's not conclusive, but it's certainly suggestive, with the report calling for a full investigation into the exports. And it's not just the report's authors who want the government to investigate. Former Labour Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell said this: David Lammy needs to come to Parliament to respond to this report and explain how his and other ministers' statements to Parliament assuring MPs that arms sales to Israel had ended when this evidence demonstrates a huge scale of arms being supplied. Asked for a response to the report, a government spokesperson said this: this government has suspended relevant licenses for the IDF that might be used to commit or facilitate serious violations of international humanitarian law in Gaza. Of the remaining licenses for Israel, the vast majority are not for the Israeli Defense Forces, but are for civilian purposes or re-export, and therefore are not used in the war in Gaza. The only exemption is the F-35 program due to its strategic role in NATO and wider implications for international peace and security. Any suggestion that the UK is licensing other weapons for use by Israel in the war in Gaza is misleading. The UK totally exposes an expansion of Israel's military operations in Gaza. We urge all parties to return urgently to talks, implement the ceasefire agreement in full, secure the release of hostages taken by Hamas, and work towards a permanent peace. I'm joined now by Janine Hirani from Palestine Youth Movement, so one of the organisations behind this report. Thank you so much for joining me. Reading this report is somewhat frustrating, isn't it? Because the categories in this sort of tax information, they're so broad that, it seems like there could be various things going on here. And I suppose my question to you is, do you think that the research done here provides a smoking gun that the UK government breached its export ban?
Yeah, I mean, the smoking gun here is that the government is lying to us, So regardless of the limitations and the challenges around the research, it is undeniable that the government is lying to us. We saw footage just before of David Lammy and the kinds of things he's saying in government or to Parliament. He pretends that, Starmer's government is only giving quote unquote helmets and goggles, and that the UK doesn't give what, in his words, they would describe routinely as arms. So he's basically categorically rejecting the fact that offensive weapons or that arms are being used or are being sent, from the UK to Israel. But what this report reveals actually is that the UK has sent thousands of military goods to Israel since October 2023. And this includes, as you mentioned, 150,000 bullets. And this includes also a further 9,000 munitions of war. And these items could include bombs, missiles. And these items are actually these categories that are broad. But even within the breadth of these categories, that single category is internationally defined as arms. So that entire category is internationally defined as arms. And so the UK is categorically sending arms from the UK to Israel. And of those 9,000 munitions that we kind of reveal in the report, over 8,000 of them, so the large majority, were sent after the suspensions of licenses in September 2024. So that's kind of the first lie that this kind of research report unravels, is that David Lammy is saying they're not sending arms, but that's not true. And the second lie is that government ministers have stated time and time again, not just Lammy, but Lammy has repeated it time and time again, that direct exports of F-35 parts from the UK to Israel have been banned since September 2024. And as you mentioned, they've admitted that they haven't stopped this global supply chain because it impacts the entire F-35 program, but they have provided reassurances time and time again that direct shipments of F-35 components from the UK to Israel have stopped. And that's something they have said categorically. But what this report actually reveals is that there is evidence to suggest that there are direct shipments of F-35 parts from the UK to Israel, and that these are ongoing as of 2 months ago. So there are multiple lies that this research exposes, even within the remit of kind of its limitations and the challenges around the opacity of the data.
Is there a way of getting, I suppose, data which is more explicit? Because I understand that this is got via sort of looking at sort of Israeli tax receipts. I suppose, do we have a right to know exactly what the UK government is exporting to different governments? Can there be a freedom of information request or something? Like, how would one acquire something even more explicit than this?
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely do have, or we should have, the right to know what the UK government is sending. The government deliberately shrouds all of this in secrecy. It is so opaque, what the UK is sending. And we've had to be, as you kind of alluded to, really creative in our methodology in order to analyze this data. We've had to, find different ways of analyzing the data and of thinking about how we can kind of use this evidence in a way that tells us some sort of story. And the fact that actually that we can glean more from what the UK is sending to Israel from Israeli data than we can tell from what the UK is releasing is a huge issue. why can we learn more about what this government is allowing to be sent to Israel through a foreign government rather than what our own government is sending? That is a huge transparency issue. That is a huge issue for us as kind of the public and as constituents. And that's why one of the key demands of the report that we're really pushing for is this demand around transparency and is for disclosure of all UK shipments from the UK to Israel.
And I just want to get your thoughts on sort of the UK's role more generally. So in terms of words, they're sort of inching towards a tougher position than they used to have, especially now Israel has made it explicit that they want to occupy the whole of Gaza and kick people out. I mean, if you were a bit creative, you could work out that was always explicit, but it's being made even more explicit than it was. I want to show you a short clip of Minister for the Middle East, Hamish, or Amish, I'm not sure, Falconer, making this statement following Israel's government approving a plan to occupy the whole Gaza Strip.
Let me make the government position crystal clear. We strongly oppose the expansion of Israel's operations. Any attempt to annex land in Gaza would be unacceptable. Palestinian territory must not be reduced nor subjected to any demographic change. We want this war to end. We want an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages, the urgent provision of humanitarian aid, and a pathway to a political solution.
Janine, do you welcome those tough words from the UK Labour government?
Well, I mean, if you ask me, it's too little too late. I mean, how many hundreds of thousands of Palestinians need to be martyred for the Labour government to finally come through with empty words is what has now happened, especially in the face of a British public who we know undeniably stands with Gaza and stands with Palestine. We have seen up to 1 million people take to the streets. We have seen students walk out of class. We've seen weapons factories shut down. We've seen a global wave of student encampments and occupations, and we've seen people shut down bridges and train stations. And now, 19 months into a genocide, this is what the Labour government has come up with is empty words. So it's really not enough, and it's really quite disgusting, but it's also expected. We always knew that the UK government and the weapons manufacturers here in Britain have blood on their hands, and this report really confirms that. It confirms that the UK government and weapons manufacturers partner to enable the massacre and genocide of our people in Gaza. And so what this evidence does is it really kind of confirms what we already knew, and it gives us the evidence base to be able to escalate, to hold the government accountable, and to create a crisis in the political establishment. Because we know, if 19 months since the genocide, that is all that this government can come up with, then we need to be taking matters into our own hands and enforcing a people's arms embargo.